Today, we are going to tell the story of Laura. A 35-year-old art restorer, she finds an ancient wooden mask while working at a historical museum. Laura tucked her hair behind her ear as she gazed at the piece in front of her. The soft light in the basement of St. Michael's Historical Museum fell over the object, highlighting its curved shapes and aged texture. It was a wooden mask, old enough to carry centuries of history, but with such a strange aura that Laura couldn't take her eyes off it. She was back at work after a 3-month break. The end of her relationship with Marcos, filled with psychological abuse, had left her shattered. The silence of the empty house weighed on her, which made her accept the offer to return to the museum without hesitation. Being back in that place, surrounded by relics from the past, seemed like a safe way to start anew. The mask, however, was unlike anything Laura had encountered before. The material, worn-out wood, had a color that shifted between brown and gray, and the inscriptions around it were indecipherable. There was no accurate information about its origin, and it seemed out of place among the other artifacts in the collection. No label, no record of who had brought it there. It was just there. Laura approached it, hesitantly. Her fingers lightly touched the irregular surface. There was something unsettling about that contact. The mask felt too warm for an object that had possibly spent centuries abandoned. Just my imagination, she thought. Lately, everything seemed to affect her in an exaggerated way. Since the breakup, the tension in her body never fully disappeared. She slept little, and nightmares pursued her, always bringing back memories of Marcos and his subtle, yet corrosive, abuses. Being back at work made her feel less lost, but that artifact, something wasn't right. She sighed and pushed the chair back, deciding to start cleaning the mask with the tools at her disposal. She would need to catalog it for the next exhibition, and the deadline for that was tight. Focusing on work always served as an effective distraction. If she could concentrate enough, maybe the echoes of her personal life would start to fade away. As she cleaned the grooves, a strange feeling grew in her chest. It was as if something, from behind the shadows of the mask, was watching her. Laura dismissed the thought, once again trying to rationalize. It was common for old objects to carry a sort of presence, and many restorers felt something similar during the process. But with this mask, the weight of that sensation seemed much more intense. Finally, after hours of meticulous work, the mask looked almost new. The inscriptions had revealed themselves a bit more, although they remained indecipherable. The object glowed faintly under the artificial light, as if it had been renewed along with its history. Laura stepped back to admire the result, but the same unease still hung in the air. Before ending her day, she approached it once again, hesitant, this time staring into the mask's hollow eyes. It was as if, somehow, it was calling her. That didn't make sense, but an insidious curiosity began to grow inside her. Her fingers moved almost impulsively, lifting the mask toward her face. For a moment, she hesitated. There was something slightly frightening about the idea of putting it on. A silent warning echoed in the back of her mind, saying it was a mistake. But Laura didn't listen. Or didn't want to listen. With a sigh, she aligned the mask with her face and gently placed it on. The first touch of the mask against Laura's face was cold, different from the warm sensation she had experienced before. There was something more, a light pressure, almost as if the object were molding itself to her face, or maybe adjusting on its own. She blinked, and then the room around her changed. At first, everything seemed normal, but gradually the edges of her vision began to distort. The shapes of the objects in the museum's basement, once stable and solid, started to ripple, as if an invisible veil were being slowly pulled over them. Laura felt her heart race. She looked around, searching for some logic in what she was seeing. Then, she heard footsteps. She quickly turned, and there was Marta, the museum's head curator, who had come down to the basement to speak with her. But something was different. Marta's face wasn't as Laura remembered it. Her skin was blotched with a sickly color, and her eyes were sunken in their sockets, as if the weight of the years had suddenly fallen upon her. "Laura, are you done for today?" Marta's voice came out hoarse, as if speaking from inside a deep tunnel. Laura jumped up, tearing the mask from her face with unnecessary force. When her eyes adjusted back to reality, Marta was there, normal, with her usual expression. There was nothing strange about her. It was just Marta, with the same stiff, formal posture as always, who hadn't even noticed Laura's odd behavior. "Is everything okay?" Marta asked, frowning. Laura nodded, feeling her face grow hot. Yes. Yes. I'll finish up soon. Marta nodded and went back upstairs, leaving Laura alone. She placed the mask on the table, her hands trembling slightly. As much as she tried to rationalize, the feeling that something had changed inside her couldn't be ignored. The mask wasn't normal. And what she had seen, brief as it was, felt too real. In the following days, Laura tried to push the memory of what had happened aside, but every time she looked at the mask, she felt a strange pull. Like an invisible force drawing her back to it. She tried to focus on work, but her mind constantly wandered to the visions and to the mask. One afternoon, after another unsettling day, Laura gave in to the temptation. She was alone in the museum, the place completely silent. The mask was where she had left it. Without thinking too much, she picked it up again and, with trembling hands, adjusted it to her face. What happened this time was much more intense. As soon as she put it on, the museum around her disappeared entirely, as if she had been transported to another place. The dark, object-filled walls gave way to a cold, empty room. In the center, a solitary figure. Laura recognized the person immediately. It was Marcos, her ex-boyfriend, sitting at a table with his head in his hands. His face was twisted in pain, and a shadow hovered around him, like a dark figure. Something inside her froze. She tore the mask off with more force than before, almost dropping it to the floor. Her hands were sweating, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear the echo in her ears. The mask was revealing something Laura didn't want to see. In the days that followed, Laura tried to distance herself from the mask. She threw it on a high shelf, out of sight. She avoided going into the museum's basement, assigning herself other tasks to avoid any contact with the object. But the more she tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. She couldn't sleep. When she closed her eyes, the flashes of visions returned with full force. The images of Marcos's twisted face, the figure hovering around him, the distorted faces of people she knew, it all felt too real, as if the visions were not just hallucinations but revelations of something she had never known. Her work started to suffer. She could no longer concentrate, and even Marta noticed, offering her some extra time off, but Laura refused. The museum was the only place where she still felt some control, even though the mask was there, whispering in the back of her mind. Finally, one night, after yet another series of nightmares, Laura gave in. She returned to the museum after hours, when it was already closed, and went down to the basement. The mask was there, in the same place she had left it. Her fingers touched it with a disturbing familiarity. She put the mask on again. This time, the visions came with brutal force. People she knew, Marta, co-workers, even neighbors, appeared before her with distorted faces, revealing secrets she could never have imagined. Marta, who had always been so strict and controlling, now appeared as a figure disfigured by years of resentment and hatred. She saw betrayals, lies, small crimes hidden behind civilized facades. Each vision made Laura question her own reality more. The people she knew seemed strange, alien, as if they had been masking their true intentions all along. The world began to feel like a web of secrets and shadows, where no one was truly trustworthy. But the worst was yet to come. In the following days, Laura convinced herself that she should stop using the mask, but something inside her kept pulling her back, as if a part of her was already connected to it in a way she could no longer control. Her hands trembled when she picked up the object, but at the same time, she felt a strange familiarity. That night, alone in her small apartment, she gave in. Staring at the reflection of the object on the table, Laura was overcome by an irresistible impulse. She put the mask on her face again, allowing it to adjust to her skin almost organically. The familiar weight settled in, but this time, something different happened. Instead of visions of others, the mask began to show something Laura feared more than anything, her own memories. Not distant memories, but scenes deeply buried in her mind. Initially, they were brief flashes, but soon they began to gain clarity. The first scene that appeared before her was of her last meeting with Marcos. They were in the apartment they shared, a heated argument about their separation. Laura had always remembered that night as a moment of liberation, the moment when she finally cut ties with him. But the mask was showing something different. She saw herself, but with an expression she didn't recognize. The look on her face wasn't one of relief, as she had always remembered, but of coldness. And Marcos, instead of being the aggressor she had always blamed, appeared visibly shaken, almost begging for understanding. He had his faults, true, but that night he seemed more vulnerable than Laura had ever allowed herself to see. The mask showed details she had erased. The words she had spoken that night were much sharper than she remembered. Deep down, Laura knew she had hurt Marcos not just to defend herself but to repay all the pain he had caused her. The mask didn't forgive, it didn't hide anything, and now it was forcing her to face the brutal truth: she had also been cruel. Laura tore the mask off violently, her body trembling. Her breathing was labored, and her heart felt like it was about to burst from her chest. The mask fell to the floor with a dull thud, but the weight of the guilt she now felt didn't dissipate. On the contrary, it seemed to have become part of her very flesh. In the days that followed, the visions continued to haunt her, even without using the mask. Sometimes, Laura would relive other parts of that relationship. Moments that seemed small, trivial, but now, seen in a new light, revealed how much of herself she had denied. More than just protecting herself, she had also hidden. Hidden her flaws, her inability to face the truth about who she really was. One night, unable to bear the pressure, Laura picked up the mask again. She knew she shouldn't put it on, but she couldn't help it. She felt that the only way to find peace was to discover everything. To face, once and for all, the buried truths the mask insisted on revealing. With trembling hands, she adjusted the object to her face, and the world around her disappeared. Now, the visions weren't just memories. They were terrible distortions of reality, where Laura was no longer the victim of her own story. She saw herself manipulating situations, playing with others' emotions in ways she had never considered. In one of the scenes, she was with an old coworker, someone who had tried to get close to her after her breakup with Marcos. Laura had always ignored him, but now she saw that her indifference had been much more calculated. She had used him emotionally to feel in control, to fill the void that Marcos had left. The mask didn't just show these moments. It began to shape her own perception of herself. With each new vision, the image Laura had of who she was began to crumble. Her face reflected in the surfaces around her appeared distorted, as if the mask were devouring her identity, revealing a version of her that was unrecognizable. Then came the final vision. A memory Laura had never wanted to revisit, the lowest point in her life with Marcos. It was a rainy night when he came home late and drunk. They argued, as they always did, but this time Laura pushed him harder than she intended. He fell to the ground, and for a moment, she thought he was seriously hurt. She felt a brief moment of relief, as if that fall could end everything. But he got up, and everything continued as before. The mask brought that moment back with unbearable clarity. Laura saw herself there again, but now she saw the expression on her own face. She hadn't felt fear or guilt in those seconds of uncertainty, but something much darker: satisfaction. The mask had captured that moment of darkness in her soul and brought it to the surface in a way she could never forget. When she removed the mask, Laura was falling apart. Her reflection in the small basement mirror seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. She could barely distinguish who the woman staring back at her was. The mask wasn't just revealing memories, it was shaping Laura, turning her into something she had always feared becoming. The following nights were torment. Even without the mask, the visions continued. Laura saw the shadows of her past projected into every aspect of her life, and she could no longer escape them. The mask wasn't just showing what she had done, but who she was, or worse, what she was becoming. The most terrifying truth, however, was that Laura knew, deep down, she deserved those visions. She deserved every fragment of pain the mask showed her, for they were reflections of a truth she had spent years trying to bury. Now, there was no escape. Laura was on the edge of the abyss. The revelations the mask had brought had destroyed her from within, each vision a stab into her already fragile psyche. She could no longer distinguish what was real from what was manipulated by the mask. She knew she needed to stop, but she also knew she couldn't. Something inside her was already deeply entangled with that malevolent object, as if their souls had fused. She spent days and nights without sleep. The visions appeared in her mind even without the mask, as if they had become a part of her. The monstrous reflection the mask had revealed about her own nature still loomed over every thought. She was losing her grip on reality, and deep down, she feared this was just the beginning of something worse. It was no longer just about seeing the truths of others or herself, it was about being consumed by them. That night, Laura knew she had to end it. She couldn't take it anymore. She was deteriorating mentally and physically. The isolation, the constant fear, and the visions of her own monstrosity were destroying her. She decided she would destroy the mask once and for all. She went to the museum after closing hours. The building was engulfed in silence, the kind of oppressive silence that seems to swallow all sound. Every step Laura took echoed through the empty corridors. When she reached the basement, the air was thick, almost suffocating. The mask was there, in the place it had always been, resting on the table as if waiting for her. With trembling hands, Laura picked up the object. She felt the cold wood against her skin and, for a moment, hesitated. Something was pulling her back, a morbid curiosity, as if there were still more truths she needed to see. She knew that putting the mask on again would mean confronting the worst that remained within her. But she needed to know, she needed to see what else was hidden in the shadows of her soul. With a deep sigh, she placed the mask on her face for the last time. Instantly, the world around her disappeared. There was no more basement, no more museum. She was in a dark void, a space without form or time. The silence was absolute. Yet, she felt the presence of something. Something immense and indescribable was watching her. Suddenly, visions began to take shape around her. But this time, they were different. They were not just fragments of her past, but terrible distortions of her own reality. She saw herself at the center of each scene, but it wasn't the Laura she knew. It was a reflection of everything she feared becoming. She saw herself manipulating the people around her, distorting her relationships, feeding off the suffering of others. It was as if the mask was revealing to Laura what she could become if she fully succumbed to the darkness that had always been inside her. In one of the visions, Laura saw herself at work, talking to Marta. But instead of being the dedicated restorer, she was manipulating Marta, using her colleagues' weaknesses to her advantage. Every gesture, every word, was filled with malice. Laura's smile was cruel, a reflection of the power the mask was offering her. The mask was revealing not only her past but also her dark potential, her worst intentions, the ones she never wanted to acknowledge. The visions intensified, and Laura began to lose control. Her mind was unraveling under the weight of so many horrible truths. She tried to tear off the mask, but it felt as if it were glued to her skin. Desperation took over. She screamed, trying to free herself, but the mask wouldn't budge. The visions continued. In one of the most brutal scenes, Laura saw herself in a new relationship, but this time, she was Marcos. She was the one manipulating, the one hurting. She was the dominant figure, controlling, inflicting emotional and psychological pain. And instead of feeling guilt, she felt pleasure. The satisfaction on her face was unmistakable. She saw herself not as the victim but as the aggressor, repeating the cycle of pain she had sworn never to relive. Laura knew it wasn't real, not yet, at least. But the mask was showing her who she could become if she didn't break the cycle. She was one step away from being devoured by that darkness, by that distorted version of herself. She needed to free herself, but the mask was firmly attached to her face, merging with her, as if it were an extension of her own soul. Her breathing grew heavier, and the sensation of claustrophobia suffocated her. The darkness around her seemed to close in from all sides, as if it were a living being, trying to absorb her. It was then that Laura realized the only way to free herself was to accept what the mask was showing her. She needed to confront her own dark side, to embrace the truths she had spent so long avoiding. With superhuman effort, she forced herself to stop fighting against the visions and, instead, face them head-on. "This is me," she whispered, accepting the truth. "But it's not all I am." The moment she made that declaration, something changed. The visions began to dissipate slowly, like smoke carried away by the wind. The darkness around her lessened, and the pressure in her chest eased. The mask, which had seemed fused to her skin, finally began to loosen. With a cry of pure determination, Laura ripped the mask from her face. It fell to the ground with a loud thud, the sound echoing in the void around her. Laura collapsed to her knees, gasping, feeling the sweat trickle down her forehead. The weight of the mask was gone, but the impact of everything she had seen still pressed down on her. The images she had witnessed, the truths the mask had revealed, wouldn't fade so easily. They had rooted themselves deep in her mind, like permanent scars. She looked at the mask on the floor, inert, seemingly harmless. Like an ordinary object, devoid of all the terror it had caused. But Laura knew that was just an illusion. The mask was alive in some way, and the terror she had experienced was not confined to that wooden object. It was inside her now, a part of her identity, a reminder of what she could have become. With one last look of disgust, Laura picked up the mask and, without hesitation, locked it in an iron box at the back of the basement. She knew she couldn't destroy it, but at least she could keep it away. At least for now. Panting and exhausted, she climbed the museum stairs, leaving the mask behind. But even so, as she walked out the door, something inside her whispered, "The cycle isn't over yet." The St. Michael Museum continued its quiet routine, now under new curators and restorers. The mask, after Laura's sudden departure, had been forgotten among other uncatalogued objects, tossed into a box in the back of the basement. Covered in dust and hidden from sight, it remained inert, waiting. It was on a quiet afternoon when Felipe, a young, newly hired restorer, found the box while organizing old artifacts. Curious, he began to examine the forgotten objects. When he pulled the mask from the box, his fingers ran over its rough and cold surface. Something about the texture and the enigmatic design captured his attention. Felipe held the mask up to eye level, observing it closely under the dim light. He had never seen anything like it. The inscriptions around the object were intriguing, almost hypnotic, and the material seemed to be in surprisingly good condition for something so old. Without thinking much of it, he took the mask to his workbench. He sat down and began to clean it, running his fingers over the carved details. There was something unsettling about the expression carved into the object, but he attributed it to the wear and tear of the wood. A slight discomfort grew at the back of his mind, but his curiosity overpowered it. He couldn't take his eyes off it. After a few minutes, Felipe, unaware of the risk, slowly lifted the mask toward his face. An uncontrollable urge overtook him, as if something was calling him. He hesitated for a moment but soon gave in to his curiosity. He adjusted the mask to his face, aligning his eyes with the empty holes. As soon as the mask touched his skin, a shiver ran down his spine, and his vision seemed to blur for a moment. For a split second, the museum around him disappeared. In its place, there was only darkness, a silent and oppressive void. Felipe ripped the mask off with a sudden yank, feeling his heart race. He laughed nervously, attributing the sensation to his imagination. Little did he know, the mask had now chosen him. And the cycle, which had seemed closed, was about to begin again.
If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support is really important to us and motivates us to bring more amazing stories. Thank you for watching.